Hello, Susan Corbett, Custom Machine Quilter, here today to talk to you about quilting the Insanity Quilt. It is so named because it has more than, well, this version of it, I guess, has more than 10,000 hand-pieced itty-bitty hexies. All right, so here's when it was first on the machine. It doesn't look like it's going to be that big of a deal, right? But look at the back of the quilt. It's just a plethora of seam allowances. So that changed the game plan for me from the very beginning. It was a heavy quilt top, really heavy. So the client and I went back and forth about what kind of batting to use in it. It's a big bed quilt. I think it was like 80 by 86 or no, I'm not sure what the dimensions were, but it's big. So I ended up using Hobbs Thermore because it's lightweight and it's white. Really easy to needle. So on the outer border, I did feathers with an inner echo, and in this first colored border, I did straight lines. So in the long vertical border, I did lines the length of it, and then I decided to keep the lines going the same way on the top and bottom part. Instead of changing directions, I kept all these lines in the same direction. And the increment of the lines is based on the middle of the hexie and then, the next set of points. So that was pretty easy to do. One of the things I decided right from the beginning was to do pairs of diagonal lines in between these sets of, I guess you can call these flowers. So it's double cross hatching, basically. And the challenge here was to try and find a path that would give me as much continuous line quilting as possible. It's a big quilt, and what I've found about hexie quilts is they just take a long time to quilt. And I kept trying to fly through this one, and I did not find such a quick path. So here I'm kind of looking for what's a quick way to get around this. So with some ruler work, I used the ruler on the outer, I think these make diamonds. So on the outer diamond path, I used the ruler, and then the inner, I just freehanded it. In the very center, I've done some continuous curve. And I was trying to do the straight lines and the diamonds as I went along. And that just wasn't going any faster. I tried and tried. It was kind of confusing. And I kept that up as long as I could, but it didn't last real long. Thankfully, I used all one color thread throughout the whole quilt. Changing thread color would have made it even more complicated. But with this nice color palette, the white worked on all of it. So I chose to do not very much dense quilting at all, and I limited the backtracking as much as possible. So I chose designs I know pretty well, some things I've shown before. The drawback of this game plan is that all the quilting seems to be pretty much the same size. So there's not as much contrast as I would have hoped, but it's okay. And in the end, the client was very pleased with all of it. She asked that in the flowers themselves, just to do some light quilting in there so they would really stand out. And in the end, they did. Okay, so giving up on a quick path throughout this section, I just chose to finally do the straight lines and then go back and individually quilt each flower. So that's what made it time consuming. The quilt was pretty stable. It didn't stretch on me because of all the dense piecing and all the seam allowance. It was not stiff, but very stable. So there's not any real ditch quilting to speak of in here. And I did quilt the whole thing as I went along. I didn't stabilize and then go back and do any more quilting. I went from top to bottom, which I don't normally do, but it worked out really well on this nice stable quilt. Okay, so having filled in the center, I'm left with these odd spaces around the perimeter of the body of the quilt. So I decided to make some partial flowers. So in that colored hexie, I did a swirl, and then I opted for two different kinds of, well, it's like a flower with either pointy edges or rounded ones. I alternated back and forth between those, just for some variety, so it doesn't get really boring. And I think that turned out pretty well. Here's how those look. I did look for any paper that might be left over in here. I looked, the client looked, and we both missed. Not a lot, but some. Now, it wasn't any fun to quilt through, but oh well. Okay, so here's the design I chose to use. This is good for a narrow border or, some kind of sashing. These spaces were irregular. And so, see, I think the benefit of freehanding is I can just tailor make these to whatever size patch I'm working on at any given time. This space right in here is bigger than, like, it's bigger in the corners than it is on the long, narrow paths. This is a cute, whimsical flower that I think is in keeping with the spirit of these 30s fabrics. It doesn't look exactly like the pattern, but I think close enough. And the benefit of this pattern, I thought, is there's lots of different paths to retrace some steps and get around pretty well. So here in the flower, I'm alternating back and forth between the background and the flower itself, and just doing some loops that go through the center and the petals, and then doing some continuous curve around the petals, and see how the seam allowance is helping raise that flower up. So that was pretty cool. Here's a different view from another angle. And in between those flowers, I'm interspersing them with some little leaves and tendrils and such, wherever there's space to do so. This is where I would have loved to do some little dense background quilting to delineate the spaces better, but it still looks pretty good. Now these green borders, from one side to the next, they're different configurations. I mean, these two side by side don't look any different, but when you turn the corner, they're different. So I had to find a design I thought would look good in all of it, where the sizes are different. So ribbon candy seemed to stand out here. It's nice and simple. It's fast to quilt. It looks good on either one. And the white thread looked really good there as well. It's nice and round and just fits really well in those little spaces. another view of those little flowers. Looks like a little fried egg. This was fun to do and it wasn't hard. The only hard part was switching from one component to the next one. And after a while, that wasn't hard anymore. It's funny how watching quilting is mesmerizing. A lot of times it feels that way when you're actually doing the quilting, not just watching it. So the zen of piecing can also be achieved when quilting if you know your design well enough. You know, you don't have to do so much thinking anymore as in the beginning. So here's a close-up of how that looks in the end. I think it's really cute. Okay, so there's another border left over in between, and I guess this is where I did the most backtracking, if any, and I tried to keep that to a minimum. So I just did a finger feather here. I have one feather in the outer border, which is pretty narrow, and so I thought for the sake of continuity, for a cohesive design scheme, some more would be okay, just as long as they're different, so that there's some contrast here. And also, this is a good one because it goes really quickly. I can do this in my sleep anymore. So with the finger feather, I forego a double line stem. I just do one line, or else you get a whole lot of thread buildup in certain places. And I like to go back and forth, you know, quilt both sides kind of at the same time. And that's tricky unless you've done it a whole lot. And I can throw in some tendrils or some leaves or whatever if need be. You could make that as fancy or as simple as you wanted to. Fill in as much or make them kind of sparse, whatever you like. Here's a different angle. And you see how the whole thing is coming together. See how the feathers up against those straight lines are a really nice, good contrast there. This quilt is pretty sweet, so the straight lines are a really good choice to kind of break up all the cute and round. The client was really happy with the way this turned out. And she got her binding on like in record time. I think she said it took her about 6 months to piece it. You know, that's a lot of dedicated hand stitching time. Apparently it was fun to do. I can't imagine doing it, but then other people tell me they can't imagine doing all this quilting either. So, same difference. Here's the finished product. I think it's gorgeous, really beautiful. Who wouldn't want one of those? So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.